They thought they were just doing their job when they arrested her, but little did they know, the woman they wronged was about to hold their future in her hands. It was a bright, unassuming afternoon in Denver, Colorado. The sun hung high in the sky, casting its warm glow over the city. The park was bustling with life. Children laughed as they darted between swings and slides. Joggers made their way along the winding path, and families spread blankets on the grass for picnics under the shelter of towering oak trees. It was the kind of day that made you forget the world's worries for a while. But for two police officers, this ordinary day would quickly spiral into something neither of them could have imagined. Officer Brad Stevens and Officer Emily Parker, both seasoned members of the Denver Police Department, were just finishing up their routine patrol. They had been driving around, responding to typical calls. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as they turned onto the park's entrance road, something caught their eye. A woman, sitting alone on a bench near the pond, her focus completely absorbed in a thick hardcover book. In the grand scheme of the afternoon, she didn't seem suspicious. Yet, something about her caught their attention. Her name was Jordan Williams, a respected attorney, known throughout the community for her sharp mind and fierce advocacy for justice. To most people, she was simply another face in the crowd, enjoying a rare moment of peace. But to Brad and Emily, she became an object of suspicion, a reason for their next move. Without any real cause, they decided to approach her. What started as an innocent encounter quickly turned into something far more sinister, as the officers began questioning her, demanding identification for reasons that seemed more about control than concern. The tension in the air thickened, as Jordan's calm and collected responses only seemed to fuel their mistrust. As the minutes dragged on, what should have been a simple conversation about nothing more than a park goer enjoying an afternoon began to feel like something more. And before long, the officers made the decision that would change everything. Jordan was arrested. What neither Brad nor Emily could have predicted was that their decision to arrest her would lead them down an unexpected path, one that would lead them straight into a courtroom. And in that courtroom, they would find themselves facing the very woman they had arrested. But this time, things would be different. This time, Jordan Williams would hold the power. She would not be the one in cuffs. She would be the one presiding over their case. The same woman they had wrongfully arrested for no reason other than their own prejudice and assumption of guilt would be the judge deciding their fate. What seemed like a momentary lapse in judgment would quickly turn into a life-altering experience for the two officers. They were about to learn a hard lesson about justice, power, and the consequences of their actions. Little did they know, they had just crossed paths with a woman who would not let them off easy, and their mistake would soon come back to haunt them in the most unexpected way. The question was, would they learn from their actions, or would they be forced to live with the repercussions of their wrongdoings? In the end, what started as an ordinary day would forever change the lives of Officer Brad Stevens and Officer Emily Parker, as they would soon discover that the person they had unjustly arrested was not just anyone. She was a woman of power, a woman who could not be silenced. And in the courtroom, she would deliver justice, not as a victim, but as the one in control. It was a picture-perfect afternoon in Denver, Colorado, a calm respite in the midst of an otherwise bustling city. The park, nestled among rows of trees that stretched their limbs toward the sky, was alive with the soothing sounds of nature. The sun hung high, casting its golden rays down through the leafy canopy, creating a warm glow that spread across the green expanse below. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and freshly cut grass. Children ran across the open field, their laughter ringing out like music as they played tag and kicked soccer balls between them. Some of them were chasing one another around the jungle gym, others weaving in and out of the swings as they took turns, each trying to go higher than the last. Their carefree joy was infectious, painting a picture of a world untouched by the worries of life. Nearby, a group of joggers ran along the winding trails, their rhythmic footsteps steady against the gentle rustle of the leaves. Some joggers wore headphones, lost in their own worlds, while others exchanged brief, breathless greetings as they passed by. On the far side of the park, a family of four sat together on a blanket, a picnic spread out before them. Laughter and conversation floated through the air, punctuated by the occasional clink of a soda can being opened or the distant sound of a ball bouncing on the pavement. The park seemed like the perfect escape, a safe haven where the world's demands were momentarily put on hold, where every person could simply enjoy the beauty of the moment. Amidst this lively scene, in stark contrast to the energy around her, sat Jordan Williams. She was alone on a bench near the pond, her back straight as she sat with her legs crossed at the ankles, a thick hardcover book resting comfortably in her lap. Her brow furrowed slightly as she read, eyes scanning each word with quiet intensity. Her dark, wavy hair framed her face, and the warm sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on her skin. She seemed a part of the park itself, calm, collected, and still. Jordan was a woman who had spent years in a courtroom, fighting for justice in the most challenging of cases. But today, she was not a lawyer or an advocate. She was just a person looking to steal a quiet moment for herself, a rare luxury in her otherwise demanding life. She had planned this break in her schedule carefully, carving out an hour for herself in the midst of a hectic week of work. The world could wait, she told herself. For once, she was going to sit, breathe, and enjoy the peacefulness of the afternoon. She was absorbed in the pages of her book, a mystery novel she'd been meaning to read for months. Her focus was absolute, and her surroundings, while pleasant, barely registered in her mind. The occasional chirp of a bird or the sound of a child's laughter was nothing more than background noise to the world she had created within the pages of her novel. But as Jordan turned the page of her book, her tranquility was abruptly interrupted by a sharp, screeching sound. Tires skidded against the asphalt, and the low rumble of a police cruiser pulling to a stop near the curb broke through the air, startling her out of her reverie. She glanced up, momentarily confused. The serenity of the park seemed to shift in an instant, as her calm was replaced by an unsettling feeling she couldn't quite place. The officers stepped out of the car, two of them, both tall and commanding. They looked around the park, their eyes scanning the peaceful scene with suspicion. And then, their gaze fell on her. Jordan wasn't sure why they were paying attention to her of all people, but something about their stance immediately fell off. The air, once so peaceful, now seemed to hum with a quiet tension, as if the park itself had taken notice of the impending conflict. Little did Jordan know, this would be the moment that would change everything. The patrol car rolled into the parking lot at the edge of the park, the tires of the cruiser crunching softly over the gravel. Officer Brad Stevens, a man in his late 30s with a stocky build and a permanent scowl, glanced over at his partner, Officer Emily Parker, a younger woman in her mid-20s with blonde hair, neatly tied back. They'd been on patrol for hours, handling routine calls. But as they drove past the park's entrance, something caught Brad's attention. "Stop here," Brad muttered, his eyes narrowing slightly as he scanned the scene before them. Emily, used to her partner's tendency to act on gut feelings, nodded and slowed the car. They came to a stop, the engine humming quietly as the two officers sat in silence for a moment, taking in the park. There were children running and playing, people jogging, and families enjoying a peaceful afternoon. But as their eyes drifted across the area, they both saw something, or rather someone, who stood out. Near the far end of the park, there was a woman sitting alone on a bench by the pond. She was the only person in the immediate vicinity who wasn't engaged in some sort of activity. She appeared entirely at ease, her attention absorbed in a thick hardcover book, her posture straight, as if she had all the time in the world. There was something about her presence that piqued their curiosity. Brad's instinct kicked in, his gaze lingering on her. There was nothing particularly alarming about the woman, yet something felt off. She didn't seem to belong to the energetic, carefree group around her. Maybe it was the fact that she was alone, or perhaps something deeper, something that Brad couldn't quite place, made her stand out. Emily was the first to speak. "You think we should check it out?" Brad hesitated for a moment, his eyes still fixed on the woman. There were no obvious signs of trouble. No one seemed to be in danger, and everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Yet, the longer he stared, the more unsettled he became. Something didn't sit right with him. "Yeah," he finally said, his voice firm with authority. "Let's make sure everything's okay. You never know." He pulled the car slowly to a stop near the curb, then switched off the engine. They both stepped out of the car, the soft click of the doors echoing in the otherwise peaceful air. Brad's boots hit the pavement first, followed by Emily's. They approached the bench where the woman was sitting, and the sound of their footsteps seemed loud against the quiet backdrop of the park. As they drew closer, Brad's gaze hardened, his suspicion growing. The woman was still engrossed in her book, her dark hair cascading down her shoulders, a faint furrow on her brow as she read. She was dressed casually, jeans and a light sweater, but there was something about her calm demeanor that seemed to trigger a reaction in him. "Ma'am," Brad called out, his voice cutting through the air with a certain authority that suggested he was used to being obeyed. "Can we talk to you for a moment?" Jordan looked up from her book, her dark eyes meeting his with a calm but wary expression. She said nothing at first, simply closing the book slowly, her fingers lingering on the cover for a moment before she placed it beside her. Her body language remained composed, and she made no attempt to rise from the bench. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice measured but polite. Brad glanced at Emily for a brief moment before turning his attention back to Jordan. "We've received a report of some suspicious activity in the area," he said, his tone flat, as if the words had been rehearsed. "We need to ask you a few questions." Jordan raised an eyebrow, a slight confusion flickering across her features. "Suspicious activity? I'm just sitting here reading." Emily stepped forward slightly, her posture stiff, as though this were more routine than she'd like to admit. "Mind if we see some ID?" Jordan's expression remained neutral, but the corner of her mouth tightened ever so slightly. "I don't understand. What's the issue here?" Brad, trying to maintain his professional demeanor, leaned slightly closer. "It's just routine," he said, though the words felt rehearsed even to his own ears. "We're just doing our job." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Jordan said nothing. She scanned the officers' faces, her mind processing their actions. Something wasn't right. She had been in these situations before, seen how certain people could be treated under the weight of suspicion. Still, she remained calm. "All right," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "If you really need to see my ID, I'll show it to you. But I want to understand why this is happening." She reached in her bag, pulling out her wallet and handing over her driver's license. Brad took it with unnecessary force, his eyes scanning the details on the card with a scrutiny that felt almost like an accusation. "Jordan Williams," he muttered, almost as if he were testing the name on his lips. "What's your business here, Miss Williams?" "I'm here to read," she said plainly, her tone unshaken. "That's all." Emily exchanged a brief glance with Brad, but neither officer seemed satisfied with the answers they were getting. The silence between them stretched out, and Jordan felt the familiar twinge of frustration, a reminder that, sometimes, it wasn't enough to simply be calm and reasonable. Brad handed her license back with a curt nod, but his eyes didn't leave her face. The tension was palpable, and Jordan could feel the undertones of judgment in the air. As the seconds ticked by, it became clear this was no ordinary stop. Brad and Emily approached Jordan with a sense of purpose, but not the kind that offered comfort or reassurance. Their footsteps were heavy, deliberate, like the sound of a storm brewing in the distance. As they drew closer, Jordan glanced up from her book, her eyes meeting theirs with a calm gaze. She didn't flinch, didn't recoil. She simply met their stare, sensing that something about this interaction would be anything but ordinary. Brad, the older of the two officers, spoke first, his voice loud and commanding. "Ma'am, can we talk to you for a moment?" Jordan set the book down gently on her lap, her fingers lingering on the cover for a moment longer than necessary. She had been in enough situations where someone had tried to intimidate her, whether it was in the courtroom or outside of it. But there was something about the way Brad spoke that didn't sit right with her. It wasn't just the forcefulness of his tone. It was the edge of something else beneath the surface, something she couldn't quite place yet. "Of course," she replied, keeping her voice steady. She gave a small nod, almost a gesture of politeness, as she closed the book and placed it carefully on the bench beside her. She was trying to maintain the calm aura she had cultivated over the years, but she could feel a ripple of unease run through her. Something was wrong here. Emily, standing a few steps behind Brad, crossed her arms over her chest, her posture rigid. She eyed Jordan from head to toe, her gaze moving slowly, almost inspecting. It wasn't casual. It wasn't professional. There was something calculating about it, something that felt judgmental. "We got a call about some suspicious activity in the area," Brad said, his eyes narrowing. What are you doing here? Jordan's eyebrows furrowed, her expression unreadable. She paused, taking a moment before answering. I'm just sitting here, reading a book, she replied evenly, her voice clear but laced with a hint of confusion. Is that a problem? Brad's gaze hardened, but he didn't immediately respond. Instead, he glanced over at Emily, who was still standing by, silently observing. Emily's eyes flicked to Jordan's bag, then back to her face. Jordan could feel the shift in the atmosphere. What had started as a simple question now felt like an accusation. Her instinct told her this was no longer a casual inquiry. Something deeper, something more troubling, was at play. The silence stretched for several seconds, thick and uncomfortable. The sound of children playing in the distance seemed muted now, as if the world around her had dimmed and focused only on this moment. Brad's voice broke the silence. Can we see some ID? The words hung in the air like an unwanted shadow. Jordan's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag, her pulse quickening ever so slightly. She had dealt with uncomfortable situations before, many times in her professional career, but this felt different. This wasn't just about suspicion. This was about control, and she could feel it, the weight of their gaze, the slow shift in their demeanor. It was like they were treating her as if she were guilty of something, even though she hadn't done anything wrong. Do you have a reason to ask for my ID? Jordan asked, her voice calm, though the question itself was sharp. She knew she was walking a fine line now. Asking questions like that could escalate things, but she needed to know where this was headed. Brad's eyes narrowed further, and he crossed his arms. It's routine, he said, but there was a tension in his voice, as if he wasn't quite convinced by his own words. The phrase routine didn't feel casual. It felt like a justification, an attempt to obscure something deeper. Jordan studied his face for a moment, her mind racing. She had dealt with many officers in her life, but something about Brad's tone, his posture, the way Emily was silently watching from behind, made her uneasy. This wasn't just a routine check. This was personal. I don't understand why you're treating me like this, she said, her patience starting to wear thin, though she still kept her voice even. I'm just reading a book, alone, in a public park. I haven't done anything wrong. Brad shifted on his feet, glancing at Emily before turning back to Jordan. His eyes lingered on her for just a beat too long. He wasn't just scanning her face for identification. He was looking for something, guilt, suspicion, a reason to take action. Emily stepped forward slightly, her tone clipped, but her words dripped with a subtle accusation. Do you always come here alone? She asked, her voice almost dismissive, as if the question itself was an inherent red flag. Jordan's mind clicked. That question, the way it was asked, it wasn't just a request for information. It was probing, digging deeper. Why does that matter? Jordan asked, her brow furrowing slightly. She could feel the thin thread of tension between them, as though they were trying to get her to say something that would justify their actions. Just wondering. Emily replied with an air of finality, though her eyes betrayed something else. A hint of skepticism, a judgment lingering just under the surface. Jordan didn't like the way Emily's eyes narrowed as they traced her every movement, almost as if she were examining a potential threat. Jordan's instincts flared. She had been the target of subtle racial biases before, both in the courtroom and outside of it. But now, in this park, in this moment, it was becoming painfully clear that this wasn't just an innocent encounter. She wasn't being asked these questions because of anything she had done. She was being questioned because of who she was, because of the color of her skin. She could feel the unease growing inside her, the weight of their questions pressing in on her. I'm not answering any more questions without a reason, Jordan said, her voice becoming firmer. She was trying to maintain control, trying to assert her right to be left alone. Brad, still standing at a distance, seemed to hesitate. There was something about the way he was looking at her now, something more calculating. Emily, too, stood there, silent but observant, as if she were waiting for Jordan to slip up. And in that moment, Jordan realized this wasn't about her. It wasn't about the book or the park or even the simple act of sitting alone. This was about something deeper, something they couldn't see in her, but something they had already decided she was. She could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating, the invisible thread of bias that lingered between them, feeding the tension. The interrogation had only just begun. The air between them grew heavy, charged with a tension that had gone unnoticed at first, but now felt as palpable as the thick summer heat. Jordan could sense it, could feel the slow shift in the officer's body language, from the casual approach they had initially presented to something far more intense, far more hostile. Despite her calm responses, the questions they asked were becoming more pointed, more invasive. She knew what this was, a test. And with each answer she gave, the officers seemed less satisfied. Brad's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as he leaned forward slightly. He hadn't yet taken his eyes off her, but his voice had changed. It was no longer polite, no longer just a query, it was a demand. "We're going to need to see some ID," Brad said, his words deliberate, sharp as if he were issuing a command, not making a request. Jordan's heart skipped a beat, her pulse quickening. She had anticipated that this might happen, but the audacity of it still struck her. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was simply sitting in a public park, reading a book. There was no reason, no reasonable explanation for why this should be happening. Her instinct screamed at her that she was being treated unfairly, but she didn't let her emotions show. She was a seasoned attorney, used to controlling her responses in even the most stressful situations. "Is this really necessary?" Jordan asked, her voice steady, though a hint of frustration lingered in her tone. She made sure to keep her composure, maintaining eye contact with Brad to show she wasn't intimidated. "I'm just here to read. There's no need for this." Brad didn't respond right away. Instead, his gaze flickered to Emily, who had remained mostly silent up until this point, but now her eyes hardened. Jordan could see that Emily's earlier stance, distant and detached, had changed. She had moved closer, her posture stiff, her arms now crossed firmly across her chest, as if to make her presence known in a way that was less than welcoming. Emily's gaze dropped to Jordan's hands, then to her bag resting at her side. It was as if she were trying to find something, anything, to justify the suspicion that was now mounting between them. Jordan's instincts told her that Emily, like Brad, had already made up her mind about her. It was an unsettling feeling, one she had grown far too familiar with throughout her career, being judged based on the color of her skin, not the content of her character. Brad's lips pressed into a thin line as he looked back at her. "It's standard procedure," he said, his voice colder than before. "We need to verify your identity. There's no harm in showing us your ID." Jordan's mind raced, her frustration now mixing with a growing sense of indignation. She knew her rights. She knew that, as a law-abiding citizen, she had the right to question the legitimacy of their request. But she also knew how easily a situation like this could escalate, how quickly something innocent could be twisted into something it wasn't. She had seen it too many times in the courtroom, where the truth was often clouded by bias. Her fingers tightened around the spine of the book, but she took a deep breath and let go, forcing herself to stay calm. She reached in her bag and pulled out her wallet, trying to keep her movements measured and deliberate, to avoid giving them any reason to escalate things further. As she handed over her driver's license, she felt the heavy weight of their eyes on her, judging her every action. Brad took the ID from her without a word, his fingers brushing against hers in a brief moment of contact. He studied the card for a beat too long, his gaze scanning the details like he was looking for a reason to doubt it. His eyes flicked back to Jordan's face, and she could see the judgment in his expression, an unspoken accusation that hung in the air like a dark cloud. It was as if her being there, simply existing in a public park, was a problem that needed to be solved. "Jordan Williams," Brad read aloud, his voice tinged with a slight mockery, though it wasn't clear whether he was mocking her name, the situation, or perhaps both. "You live here in Denver?" Jordan nodded, her patience thinning. "Yes," she said, her voice still calm, but now firm. "I live here. I came here to read. That's all." She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the urge to stand up, to challenge them directly, but she knew she couldn't let her emotions take over. That would only give them more ammunition to turn this into something bigger than it already was. She had to stay calm, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Brad's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't quite a frown either. It was more like a smirk, one that conveyed a subtle sense of superiority. He glanced at Emily again, as if silently communicating something between them. Emily's expression remained unreadable, but there was something in the way she stood that made Jordan uneasy. "Do you always come here alone?" Emily asked, her voice laced with suspicion, her tone almost accusatory. "You don't seem like the type to come out here and just relax." Jordan's jaw tightened at the question. It was too personal, too invasive. What did it matter whether she was alone or not? The question itself seemed irrelevant, but it was clear now that they weren't interested in understanding her or the situation. They were looking for a reason to justify their treatment of her. "I'm just reading a book," Jordan repeated, her patience rapidly waning. "I'm not causing any trouble. This is a public park." Brad's eyes narrowed, his patience also wearing thin. "We don't like being lied to," he said, his voice low. "We'll see what's in your bag." Jordan's heart sank as she realized where this was headed. She had hoped that maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't go any further. But now, it was clear that they were determined to escalate this. And before she could say anything else, Emily moved quickly, pulling out a pair of handcuffs from her belt. "You're under arrest," Emily said, her tone flat, her decision made. The words hung in the air, like the final note in a song. Jordan's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It wasn't just a moment of bad judgment. This was deliberate. And in that moment, Jordan realized that she wasn't going to walk away unscathed. The tension in the air was palpable now, thick with the weight of an escalating confrontation that neither Jordan nor the officers could ignore. Brad's face was set in a rigid expression, his jaw clenched as if he had already made up his mind. Emily stood to the side, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze fixed on Jordan with a coldness that sent a chill through the air. Jordan could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the disbelief she felt at the absurdity of it all boiling inside her. She had been calm, composed, had answered their questions. She had been polite, even when their tone had shifted from questioning to accusatory. She had done nothing to deserve this treatment, nothing other than existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yet, here they were, treating her as though she were a criminal. "I don't understand," Jordan said, her voice rising slightly, a tremor of frustration breaking through her calm. She stood up from the bench, her eyes moving between Brad and Emily. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm just sitting here. Why are you doing this?" Brad's response was swift, his expression unyielding. "You're under arrest," he said, his voice final, without a shred of empathy. The words hit Jordan like a punch to the stomach. Her mind raced. Was this really happening? Was she really being arrested for sitting alone in a park, reading a book on a peaceful afternoon? "No," she protested, shaking her head in disbelief. "You can't be serious. This is outrageous." The officers didn't respond. Instead, Brad reached for his cuffs, the cold click of metal echoing in the stillness of the park. The handcuffs were harsh against her wrists, the cold metal a sharp contrast to the warmth of the afternoon sun. It felt like a betrayal of everything she had believed about justice, fairness, and the rule of law. Jordan instinctively pulled her arms away, trying to avoid the cold touch of the cuffs, but Emily's hand shot out, holding her firmly in place. "We're doing this the easy way," Emily warned, her voice tight, no longer trying to mask the edge of authority in her tone. Jordan's stomach twisted, a surge of helplessness rising in her chest. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Her thoughts raced, but she couldn't focus long enough to make sense of them. The officers were treating her like a criminal, and all she could do was stand there, handcuffed, as they pushed her toward their patrol car. "I'm an attorney," Jordan said, the words spilling from her mouth before she could stop them. "I'm not some criminal you can just drag away like this. I'm going to file a complaint. I will fight this." Brad didn't even flinch at her words. His eyes remained cold, unbothered. "Save it for court," he muttered, as he guided her toward the cruiser, her steps heavy with the weight of her disbelief. Everything she had worked for, everything she had believed in about fairness and the law, was unraveling before her eyes. And in that moment, Jordan realized that her fight wasn't just for herself. It was for the many others who had been treated like this, who had been wronged in ways that no one ever seemed to care about. Months had passed since that fateful day in the park, but for Officer Brad Stevens and Officer Emily Parker, the memory of their encounter with Jordan Williams remained vivid. What had started as a routine patrol had spiraled into an arrest that neither of them could have predicted. And now, as they sat in the defendant's chair, their nerves were frayed, their minds racing. They had no idea what to expect in the courtroom, but what they didn't know was that today, justice was about to take on a new form. The courtroom was a sea of quiet murmurs and shuffling papers. The air was thick with anticipation, as if everyone present could feel the gravity of the moment hanging just beyond the threshold. The judge's bench was empty, a silence settling over the room as the bailiff called the court to order. The case at hand was one that had attracted attention across the city. The arrest of a respected attorney in a public park by two officers who had misjudged the situation from start. It wasn't just about the arrest anymore. It had become a symbol of something larger, a struggle for justice in the face of injustice. Brad sat stiffly in the defendant's chair, his fingers tapping nervously against the armrest. Beside him, Emily tried to mask her own anxiety, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Neither of them had been able to shake the gnawing feeling that this was not going to be an ordinary court case. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the woman they had arrested, the woman they had so wrongly accused, was now the one who held the power. As the door to the judge's chamber swung open, the tension in the room seemed to snap to attention. All eyes turned toward the entrance as a figure emerged, walking confidently toward the bench. The gavel sounded, cutting through the murmur of the crowd as the judge took her seat. But it wasn't just any judge. It was Jordan Williams. The room fell into stunned silence. Brad's mouth went dry, and he stiffened in his seat as he stared at the woman he had arrested months earlier, now wearing the black robe and gavel of a judge. His heart skipped a beat as the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He was about to face her, not as a suspect or a civilian, but as the judge who would determine his fate. Jordan's eyes scanned the courtroom, her gaze sharp and measured, taking in the scene with an almost eerie calm. She didn't look at the officers immediately. Instead, she surveyed the room, her demeanor exuding authority. This was her space now. She was in control, and she knew it. The same woman they had wrongfully detained, who had been treated as a suspect, was now the one who would pass judgment on them. The irony was impossible to miss, and the poetic justice of it all hung in the air like a silent verdict. Brad shifted uncomfortably in his seat, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. Emily's eyes widened as she exchanged a quick glance with him, her lips pressed into a thin line. Neither of them had expected this. They hadn't anticipated facing Jordan in a courtroom, let alone in the position of power she now held. "Court is in session," Jordan announced, her voice firm, unwavering. There was no trace of the woman they had arrested in the park. No uncertainty, no fear. She was no longer a victim of their bias. She was a judge, an authority figure in the legal world, and she intended to ensure that justice would prevail. Brad opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He could barely process the situation as his mind raced back to that day in the park. The memories were vivid. Her calm, collected responses, her disbelief at being questioned, and the harsh click of the handcuffs that had sealed her fate. Now, it was his fate that rested in her hands. "I'm sure you're all familiar with the details of this case," Jordan continued, her voice calm but tinged with an undercurrent of authority. "Officer Brad Stevens and Officer Emily Parker, you stand accused of unjustly arresting a civilian without probable cause. The woman you arrested that day is now sitting before you as your judge. Let's proceed." Brad's throat tightened as Jordan's gaze landed on him. It was like a punch to the gut. He had been so certain that their actions in the park had been justified. He had believed in his power as an officer, in his right to question anyone, anywhere. But now, as Jordan looked at him, he felt small, exposed. His authority felt fragile, almost laughable, in the face of the very justice he thought he was upholding. Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her fingers drummed nervously on the table in front of her, and she could feel her breath quicken. She glanced at Brad, searching his face for some sign of reassurance, but all she saw was the same shock that was blooming inside her chest. She had never imagined a situation like this. Neither of them had. Jordan turned her attention to the prosecution, her voice authoritative as she laid out the case against the officers. Each word she spoke seemed to resonate with the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Her wrongful arrest, the bias that had clouded the officer's judgment, and the irony of their presence in her courtroom. The silence in the room deepened, as if everyone present understood the significance of what was unfolding before them. "Officer Stevens, Officer Parker," Jordan said, her gaze unwavering as she addressed them directly. "You acted without justification, and now you will face the consequences of your actions." The words stung like a slap to the face, and Brad felt the weight of his own misjudgment crashing down on him. The tables had turned. The woman they had wronged was now the one in control. And this time, there would be no escape from the consequences. The courtroom was filled with a palpable sense of discomfort. Officer Brad Stevens and Officer Emily Parker sat in the defendant's chairs, their backs rigid and their eyes fixed firmly on the floor. The weight of the situation had begun to sink in. The woman they had arrested, the one they had wrongfully assumed to be suspicious, was now the one in charge. She wasn't just any judge, either. She was Jordan Williams, the very woman they had treated with disdain and prejudice months ago. And now, she was the one who would decide their fate. Jordan Williams sat behind the bench, her posture calm but authoritative. She exuded professionalism, her dark eyes scanning the courtroom with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The black robe she wore gave her a powerful presence, a sharp contrast to the way she had been treated by the officers on that warm afternoon in the park. Her gaze swept over the room, taking in the faces of the witnesses, the lawyers, and, of course, the officers sitting in the defendant's chairs. She knew that they understood the significance of this moment. Jordan's voice cut through the silence of the room, clear and commanding. "Officer Stevens, Officer Parker, do you remember me?" she asked, her tone even, yet carrying an undeniable weight. Brad shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands gripping the sides of the chair as if trying to steady himself. He didn't respond immediately, his eyes avoiding Jordan's. The memory of that day was too fresh, too uncomfortable to face directly. Emily, sitting beside him, was similarly tense. She cleared her throat, but said nothing, her gaze flicking nervously between Jordan and the floor. The officers had been through many trials in their careers, but this was different. This wasn't some faceless defendant they could dismiss or overpower. This was a woman they had wronged, and she was now in control of the situation. The realization hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Jordan's eyes remained locked on them, unfazed by their discomfort. "I ask again," she continued, her voice unwavering. "Do you remember me?" Finally, Brad nodded, but only briefly, his jaw tight. "Yes," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Jordan's gaze softened for a moment, but her tone remained firm. "I see," she said. "Then you should also remember what happened that day. You and your partner approached me in the park, assumed I was doing something wrong, and treated me like a criminal. For what? Because I was sitting alone, reading a book?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, the courtroom was completely still. Brad's discomfort grew as he shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming nervously on the armrest. Emily glanced at him, and the brief exchange of looks between them told Jordan everything she needed to know. They knew they were wrong. They knew that their actions had been based on nothing but suspicion fueled by bias, not fact. Jordan continued, her voice calm but cutting. "You made assumptions about me based on the color of my skin. You didn't ask questions. You didn't consider the possibility that I was simply enjoying a rare moment of peace. You decided I was a threat, and you arrested me. For what exactly?" Brad shifted again, his throat tight as he cleared it. "We had a reason to be suspicious," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We were responding to a call about suspicious activity. We had to investigate." Jordan raised an eyebrow, her gaze never leaving his. "A call about suspicious activity? A call, mind you, that was never confirmed. And even then, you felt the need to approach me in such an aggressive manner, without so much as an explanation." She shook her head slowly, disappointment clear in her expression. "You weren't investigating anything. You were profiling me. And when I didn't fit into the narrative you had created in your heads, you decided I was the problem." The courtroom was quiet, the weight of her words sinking in. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their faces flushed with a mix of guilt and defensiveness. Emily tried to speak, but her voice faltered, the words seemingly stuck in her throat. She glanced at Brad, who gave her a slight shake of his head, signaling that now wasn't the time to argue. Jordan leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as she addressed them again. "You both made assumptions about me based on the color of my skin," she said, her voice steady but laced with an undeniable authority. "You both failed to see me as a human being, someone simply enjoying a quiet day in the park. Instead, you treated me like a criminal before I even had a chance to speak. Now, I will make a judgment about your actions." The tension in the courtroom thickened as Jordan's words reverberated through the room. Brad and Emily exchanged uneasy glances, both of them knowing that their actions had been wrong, but neither of them able to fully admit it. They had been trained to follow protocol, to act with authority, but what they had failed to grasp in that moment was the simple truth. Authority did not give them the right to treat others with disrespect or to act out of prejudice. Jordan's eyes never wavered as she continued, her gaze now locked firmly on both officers. "This case isn't just about the mistakes you made that day. This is about accountability. You failed to uphold the standards of justice that you swore to protect. You failed to see me as a person, as a member of this community." She paused, letting her words settle in the air, the weight of the truth hanging over the officers. For the first time, they seemed to fully understand the gravity of what they had done. The smug confidence that had once accompanied their behavior had evaporated, replaced by a creeping sense of regret. Jordan sat back in her chair, her posture still straight, her presence commanding yet composed. "I will make my judgment, and I will not let the actions of the few stain the justice that we all deserve." The courtroom fell silent again, the only sound now the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall. In that moment, the officers knew they weren't just facing a judge. They were facing the woman they had wronged, and the consequences of their actions were now in her hands. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as Jordan Williams leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped in front of her on the bench. The weight of the moment seemed to press down on everyone in the room. Officer Brad Stevens and Officer Emily Parker sat, their faces tense and uncertain. The lawyers, witnesses, and even the spectators waited with bated breath for the judge to make her decision. Jordan had listened carefully to all the testimony, observed the way the officers had responded, and seen firsthand how their actions had escalated the situation unnecessarily. Now, it was time to render her judgment. Jordan's gaze swept across the room, making eye contact with the officers for a brief moment before turning her attention to the rest of the courtroom. She let the silence hang there for just a moment longer, allowing the tension to build. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable strength to it, her authority clear and undeniable. After hearing all the testimonies and reviewing the evidence presented in this case, she began, her eyes focused on Brad and Emily. "I have reached my decision." She paused, allowing the room to quiet further before continuing. "The actions of both Officer Stevens and Officer Parker on that day in the park were nothing short of discriminatory. You made assumptions about a civilian based purely on the color of her skin and subjected her to an unjustified interrogation. You escalated the situation instead of de-escalating it, and you violated the trust that the public places in those who wear the badge." The words hung in the air, their weight sinking in deep. Brad's shoulders sagged, and he couldn't meet Jordan's gaze anymore. Emily's face had gone pale, her lips pressed tightly together, the reality of the situation beginning to dawn on her. They had underestimated the woman they had wronged. They had treated her as an inconvenience when, in reality, she had held more power in that courtroom than they ever could have imagined. Jordan continued, her voice unwavering. "I find the actions of both officers to be in violation of the very standards of conduct that law enforcement is supposed to uphold. This was not just a simple mistake or a misunderstanding. This was an abuse of power." She paused, watching the officers carefully as she allowed the gravity of her words to sink in. They looked uncomfortable, but she knew that discomfort was nothing compared to the impact of her decision. "Therefore," Jordan said, her tone firm, "you're both hereby suspended from duty, pending further investigation. You will remain on administrative leave while an internal review is conducted to determine whether further disciplinary actions are warranted." The decision was final. There was no room for debate, no opportunity for appeals. The officers had been held accountable, not just for their actions in that moment, but for the systemic biases that had colored their judgment from the start. Jordan's eyes didn't soften as she looked at them. Instead, she gave one final, resolute statement. Justice will not be swayed by authority, and it will not be compromised by bias. This is the verdict. As she finished speaking, a murmur rippled through the courtroom, a mix of relief and tension breaking in the air. The officers sat in stunned silence, unable to process the weight of what had just occurred. For the first time, they were being held accountable for their actions that had been born from a place of prejudice. But now, those actions would have consequences. Jordan gave a small, decisive nod as the court began to adjourn. The gavel slammed down, signaling the end of the trial and the beginning of a new chapter, where fairness and accountability were no longer just ideals, but actions carried out with integrity. The gavel fell with a sharp crack, marking the official end of the trial. The room was still, the tension slowly beginning to dissipate as the weight of Jordan Williams's verdict settled in. Officer Brad Stevens and Officer Emily Parker stood up, their movements slow and heavy, as if the reality of their punishment had finally sunk in. They had been humbled, defeated by the woman they had once tried to intimidate. The eyes of the courtroom followed them as they made their way toward the exit, their heads low, their shoulders slumped in defeat. The officers had come in expecting to stand as the authority, but they left as the ones who had been held accountable for their actions. Jordan remained seated behind a bench, her posture straight, her expression calm and composed. She watched the officers leave, but there was no satisfaction in her gaze, only a quiet, resolute strength. She had been wronged, but today, justice had been served. It wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring that the system worked the way it was meant to. In that moment, Jordan realized that this was bigger than just her. This was about standing up for what was right, about holding those in power accountable when they abused that power. As the officers disappeared from view, the courtroom slowly began to empty. The murmurs of spectators filled the air, but Jordan didn't join in. She remained in her seat, reflecting on the case and the journey it had taken her on. She had seen firsthand the dangers of assumptions, the destructive power of prejudice, and the way that racial bias could taint even the most routine encounters. But she had also seen the strength of justice and the importance of fighting for fairness, no matter the odds. Outside the courtroom, the world moved on. People continued with their daily lives, unaware of the battle that had just taken place behind those doors. But for Jordan, the trial had been more than just a moment in time. It was a reminder that change could happen, that those who spoke up could make a difference. And while the officers had been held accountable, Jordan knew that the real victory lay in the message sent, that injustice, no matter how subtle or seemingly small, would not go unchallenged. She stood up from the bench, her movements deliberate and measured. With one final glance at the empty courtroom, she turned and walked toward the door, her head held high. There was no need for celebration. This wasn't a victory to be shouted from the rooftops. It was a victory that spoke for itself, in the quiet confidence of a job well done. As she stepped out of the courtroom, she knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice didn't end here. And for Jordan, the fight would never stop.